The hangar doors groaned open at Riverside Municipal Airport as the morning fog rolled across the tarmac. Inside, 23-year-old Maya Rodriguez clutched her flight manual so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She stood at the base of a single-engine Cessna 172, its propeller gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and felt her stomach drop as if she were already airborne. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You sure you're in the right place? The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, a cocky second-year student who'd been flying since he was 16. He leaned against the wing of his aircraft, arms crossed, watching Maya with barely concealed amusement. Maybe you meant to sign up for ground school instead. Maya's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages of her manual, pretending to study pre-flight procedures she'd already memorized. The truth was, she'd been preparing for this moment for 3 years. 3 years of saving every penny from her job at the local diner. 3 years of studying aviation theory in her cramped studio apartment. 3 years of dreaming about something that terrified her more than anything else in the world. The irony wasn't lost on her. Maya Rodriguez, who couldn't stand on a second-story balcony without breaking into a cold sweat, wanted to become a pilot. Not just any pilot, but a commercial airline captain. She wanted to command massive aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers across continents, wanted to navigate through storm systems and land in crosswinds that would make seasoned aviators nervous. But first, she had to survive her first lesson. Rodriguez. Chief Flight Instructor Captain William Hayes emerged from the flight planning office, his weathered face set in its usual expression of professional skepticism. At 62, Hayes had been teaching people to fly for over 30 years, and he'd seen every type of student imaginable. The overconfident ones who thought flight simulators had taught them everything. The naturally gifted ones who made it look effortless. The methodical ones who studied every manual but froze when it came to practical application. And then there were the ones like Maya, the ones who showed up with more determination than natural ability, more dreams than practical experience, more fear than they knew what to do with. "Yes, sir," Maya responded, her voice barely above him. Whisper. Hayes looked her up and down, taking in her pressed khaki pants, her perfectly ironed white button-down shirt, her boots polished to a military shine. Everything about her appearance screamed preparation and professionalism. Everything except the way her hands shook as she held her materials. "First lesson?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir." "Ever been in a small aircraft?" "Before?" Maya hesitated. "No, sir." Jake Morrison snorted with laughter. "This should be interesting. Hey, Rodriguez, you know they make these things fly pretty high, right? Like thousands of feet above the ground?" A few other students had gathered around now, drawn by the entertainment value of watching someone who was clearly out of their element. There was Ashley Chen, a trust fund kid whose father owned an aviation business. Marcus Thompson, a former military mechanic who decided to pursue his pilot's license at 45. And Sarah Williams, a natural pilot who'd soloed after just 10 hours of instruction. "Leave her alone, Jake," Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried enough authority to make him step back. "Everyone starts somewhere." Maya felt a flush of gratitude towards Sarah, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the familiar surge of anxiety that came whenever she thought about actually leaving the ground. She'd been battling acrophobia since childhood, ever since the incident at her 8th birthday party when she'd climbed too high on the jungle gym and frozen completely, unable to move up or down until the fire department had to come get her. The other kids had laughed then, too. And they'd kept laughing through middle school whenever they passed the tall buildings downtown and she'd instinctively look away from the upper floors. Through high school when she'd refused to go to the senior party on the roof of the Marriott. Through community college when she'd taken the stairs to the 3rd floor, rather than risk the glass elevator that offered views of the campus quad below. But somewhere along the way, between the laughter and the limitations her fear had placed on her life, Maya had made a decision. She was going to become a pilot not despite her fear of heights, but because of it. She was going to prove to herself and everyone else that fear didn't have to define what you could achieve. "All right, people, enough standing around," Hayes announced. "Rodriguez, you're with me. We'll start with the basics." As the other students dispersed to their assigned aircraft, Maya followed Hayes to the Cessna she'd been staring at earlier. Up close, it looked even more fragile than she'd imagined. The aluminum skin was thin enough that she could see the rivets holding it together. The wings flexed slightly in the morning breeze. The whole thing seemed impossibly delicate for something that was supposed to carry human beings into the sky. "First rule of aviation," Hayes said, beginning his walk-around inspection. "Never assume anything is working correctly. We check everything, every time, no exceptions." He moved methodically around the aircraft, examining control surfaces, checking fluid levels, testing the security of various panels and components. Maya followed him, trying to absorb every detail while fighting the growing knot in her stomach. The rational part of her mind knew that small aircraft were statistically safer than automobiles. She'd memorized the accident statistics, studied the safety records, understood intellectually that millions of people flew an aircraft like this every year without incident. But the irrational part of her mind, the part that had been shaped by years of avoiding heights, was screaming that this was insane. That human beings weren't meant to leave the ground. That the natural order of things involved staying firmly planted on solid earth. "You okay, Rodriguez?" Hayes asked, noticing her pale complexion. "Yes, sir. Just concentrating." Hayes had been doing this long enough to recognize the signs. The shallow breathing, the tense posture, the way she kept glancing up at the aircraft as if it might suddenly sprout wings and take off without her. He'd seen it before, though rarely in someone who'd voluntarily signed up for flight training. "Tell me something," he said, stopping his inspection. "Why do you want to learn to fly?" Maya was quiet for a long moment. Around them, other aircraft were starting their engines, filling the air with the distinctive sound of small airplane engines warming up. The smell of aviation fuel and morning dew mixed in the cool air. "I want to be an airline pilot," she said finally. "I want to fly for one of the major carriers. International routes, if possible." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "That's a pretty ambitious goal. Takes a lot of training, a lot of flight hours, a lot of money. Most people who want to fly professionally start with some kind of aviation background. Military, family in the business, that sort of thing. I know. I've researched it extensively. And you're sure this is what you want to do?" Maya looked up at the aircraft towering above them, its wings catching the morning sunlight. For a moment, the fear was overwhelming. Her palms were sweating, her heart was racing, and every instinct she had was telling her to walk away. But then she thought about her mother, working double shifts at the hospital to help pay for these lessons. About her younger brother, who'd told everyone at school that his sister was going to be a pilot. About all the nights she'd spent studying aircraft systems and weather patterns and navigation procedures, dreaming of a life that seemed impossible. "Yes, sir, I'm sure." Hayes nodded slowly. "All right then. Let's see what you're made of." The pre-flight inspection took 45 minutes, though it felt like hours to Maya. Hayes explained every step in detail, from checking the oil level to testing the control surfaces to verifying that the fuel tanks were properly filled and vented. Maya absorbed every word, taking notes in a small notebook she'd brought specifically for this purpose. "The thing about aviation," Hayes said as they completed their walk around the aircraft, "is that it's incredibly unforgiving of mistakes. On the ground, if you make an error, you might dent your car or bruise your ego. In the air, mistakes can kill you. That's why we're so methodical about everything." Maya nodded, though the word kill sent another spike of anxiety through her system. She'd read about aviation accidents, studied the reports, understood intellectually that most were caused by pilot error. That could have been prevented with proper training and attention to detail. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were very different things. "Ready to get in?" Hayes asked, opening the door on the left side of the aircraft. Maya stared at the narrow cockpit, barely wide enough for two people to sit side by side. The control panel seemed impossibly complex, covered with dozens of gauges, switches, and indicators. Through the windscreen, she could see the runway stretching out toward the horizon, disappearing into the morning haze. "Rodriguez?" "Yes." "Sir, ready." She climbed into the right seat, her legs feeling unsteady as she settled into the worn leather. Hayes got in beside her and immediately began pointing out the various controls and instruments. The altimeter, which would tell them how high they were above sea level. The airspeed indicator, which would show how fast they were moving through the air. The attitude indicator, which would show whether they were climbing, descending, or flying. "Level. This is a lot to take in on your first day," Hayes said, noticing her overwhelmed expression. "Don't worry about memorizing everything right now. We'll go over it all again, multiple times. For today, I just want you to get comfortable with the idea of being in the aircraft." Maya gripped the side of her seat as Hayes started the engine. The propeller began to turn, slowly at first, then faster until it became a blur. The entire aircraft vibrated with the engine's power, and Maya felt her stomach drop even though they were still firmly on the ground. "Everything okay?" Maya forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir." Hayes keyed the radio and spoke to the control tower, requesting permission to taxi to the runway. The response came back immediately, a calm voice giving them clearance to proceed. As Hayes released the brakes and the aircraft began to move forward, Maya gripped her seat even tighter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They taxied slowly across the airport, past other aircraft and ground vehicles, following the yellow lines painted on the asphalt. Other students waved from their cockpits as they passed, and Maya tried to wave back, though her hand was shaking. Too badly to make much of a gesture. "First time is always overwhelming," Hayes said, his voice gentle but professional. "The important thing is to stay calm and focus on learning. You don't have to be perfect today or even good. You just have to be willing to try." As they approached the runway, Hayes ran through the pre-takeoff checklist, explaining each item as he went. Engine instruments checked and in the green. Flight controls free and correct. Fuel selector on both tanks, mixture rich. Propeller high RPM, the familiar ritual of ensuring everything was working properly before committing to flight. Tower. Cessna 4-7-2-Alpha-Charlie, ready for takeoff, runway 27, Hayes radioed. Cessna 472 Alpha Charlie, runway 27, cleared for takeoff, wind 240 at 8 knots. Hayes acknowledged the clearance and turned onto the runway. Ahead of them, the asphalt stretched out for nearly a mile, marked with white lines and numbers that seemed to blur together in Maya's nervous vision. On either side, grass fields extended to the horizon, broken only by the occasional farmhouse. "Or barn. Here we go," Hayes said, pushing the throttle forward. The engine noise increased dramatically, and Maya felt herself pressed back into her seat as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. The world outside began to blur past the windows, faster and faster, until suddenly the vibration from the landing gear stopped, and Maya realized they were no longer touching the ground. They were flying. Maya's breath caught in her throat as she looked out the window and saw the earth falling away below them. The airport buildings grew smaller, the cars on the nearby highway looked like toys, and the patchwork of fields and forests spread out beneath them like a living map. "How are you doing?" Hayes asked, his voice calm and reassuring through the intercom. Maya tried to answer, but no words came out. She was gripping the sides of her seat so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. The logical part of her mind was amazed by the view, by the incredible sensation of flight, by the fact that she was actually doing something she'd dreamed about for so long. But the fearful part of her mind was in complete panic. They were hundreds of feet above the ground now, climbing higher every second. And if something went wrong, if the engine quit or the wings fell off or any of 1,000 other catastrophic failures occurred, they would fall out of the sky and die. "Maya," Hayes said, using her first name for the first time. "Look at me." She turned toward him, her eyes wide with terror. "You're safe," he said simply. "This aircraft has been flying for over 30 years. I've been flying for over 40. The engine is running perfectly, the weather is ideal, and we're in complete control. You're going to be fine." Maya nodded, though she didn't feel fine. She felt like she was going to throw up or pass out or both. Below them, the world continued to shrink as they climbed to their assigned altitude of 3,000 feet. "I want you to try something," Hayes said. "Put your hand on the control yoke right here." He indicated the steering wheel-like device in front of her seat. Maya hesitated, then slowly moved her right hand to the yoke. Through the connection, she could feel the aircraft responding to the air currents, the subtle pressures and movements that kept them aloft. "Feel that?" Hayes asked. "That's the aircraft talking to you. It's telling you about the wind, about the lift being generated by the wings, about the balance between all the forces that keep us in the air. Flying isn't about fighting those forces. It's about understanding them, working with them." 4. The first time since they'd taken off, Maya felt a tiny spark of something other than pure terror. The aircraft did seem to be communicating through the controls, giving her information about its state and condition that she could learn to interpret. "I'm going to let you fly for a minute," Hayes said. "I'll keep my hands near the controls. But I want you to make some gentle turns. Left and right, nothing dramatic. Just get a feel for how the aircraft responds." Maya's first instinct was to refuse, to tell him there was no way she was ready for that. But something in his calm, confident manner made her think maybe she could try. Very carefully, she applied slight pressure to the left side of the yoke. The aircraft banked gently to the left, and Maya felt a surge of something that might have been pride. She was actually controlling the aircraft, actually flying. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "Good," Hayes said. "Now try the other direction." Maya moved the yoke to the right, and the aircraft responded obediently, banking in the opposite direction. Below them, the landscape rotated slowly, giving her different perspectives on the same terrain. "You're a natural," Hayes said, and Maya felt a warmth spread through her chest despite her fear. "Most students are jerky with the controls at first, over-controlling everything. You're being very smooth and deliberate." They spent the next 20 minutes practicing basic maneuvers. Gentle turns, slight climbs and descents, the fundamentals of aircraft control. Maya was still terrified, still gripping the controls with white knuckles, but she was beginning to understand what Hayes meant about the aircraft talking to her. When they finally returned to the airport and landed, Maya felt as if she'd been through an emotional hurricane. She was exhausted, exhilarated, terrified, and proud all at the same time. As they taxied back to the hangar, she realized she was already thinking about the next lesson. "How was that?" Hayes asked as they shut down the engine and began the post-flight inspection. Maya was quiet for a long moment, trying to process everything she'd experienced. "Terrifying," she said finally, "but also incredible." Hayes smiled. "That's exactly the right answer. If you weren't scared, I'd be worried about you. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you respectful of what you're doing. The trick is learning to manage it, not let it control you." As they walked back toward the flight school office, Maya saw Jake, Morrison, and several other students waiting near the entrance. From their expressions, she could tell they'd been watching her lesson with interest. "So, Rodriguez," Jake called out as she approached, "still think you want to be a pilot?" Maya looked at him, then at the aircraft they'd just flown, then back at the group of students who were clearly expecting her to admit defeat. For a moment, she considered telling them the truth about how scared she'd been, how many times she'd wanted to ask Hayes to turn around and go back. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and looked Jake directly in the eye. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." That night, Maya sat in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the flight. Her hands were still shaking, slightly, and she could still feel the sensation of being suspended in the air, held aloft by nothing but the laws of physics and the skill of the pilot. She thought about her mother, who'd called earlier to ask how the lesson had gone. Maya had given her a sanitized version of events, focusing on the technical aspects and leaving out the parts about being paralyzed with fear. Her mother was already worried enough about her daughter's career choice without knowing how terrified she'd been. She thought about her brother, who'd texted her a dozen times throughout the day asking for updates. He was so proud of her for pursuing her dream, so confident that she was going to succeed. Maya didn't want to disappoint him by admitting how difficult this was going to be. Most of all, she thought about Hayes and his calm, patient instruction. He'd seen her fear, understood it, and helped her work through it without making her feel ashamed or inadequate. He'd also seen something in her flying that she hadn't seen in herself: potential. Maya opened her flight manual and began studying the material for the next lesson. She had a lot to learn, a lot of fear to overcome, and a lot of people to prove wrong. But for the first time since she'd started dreaming about becoming a pilot, she believed it might actually be possible. The next morning, she arrived at the airport 2 hours early, wanting to spend time around the aircraft before her lesson. She found Hayes in the hangar, performing a detailed inspection on the Cessna they'd flown the day before. "You're here early," he observed, not looking up from his work. "I wanted to watch you do the inspection," Maya said. "I want to learn everything I can." Hayes smiled. "Good attitude. Hand me that flashlight, would you? I want to check the landing gear oleo struts." As Maya helped him with the inspection, she found herself asking dozens of questions about aircraft systems, maintenance procedures, and the theory behind why aircraft flew. Hayes answered each question patiently, clearly pleased with her enthusiasm. "You know," he said as they finished the inspection, "in 30 years of flight instruction, I've taught hundreds of students. Some of them were naturals who made it look easy. Some of them were overconfident and had to learn humility the hard way. Some of them were mechanically inclined and understood the aircraft intuitively." He paused, securing a panel they'd been examining. "But the ones who become truly exceptional pilots, the ones who go on to have long, successful careers, they all have one thing in common. They respect the aircraft and the environment they're operating in. They understand that every flight is a learning experience, and they're always trying to improve." Maya felt a flutter of hope. "And you think I have that?" "I think you have the potential for it. Yesterday, you were scared, but you didn't let the fear paralyze you. You listened to instruction, you asked good questions, and you handled the controls with respect. That's a good foundation to build on." As other students began arriving for their lessons, Maya noticed the look she was getting. Some were curious, some were skeptical, and a few seemed openly dismissive. She realized she was going to have to prove herself not just to her instructors, but to her fellow students as well. During her second lesson, Hayes introduced her to the concept of stalls. Not engine failure, but the aerodynamic condition that occurred when the wing's angle of attack became too steep and it stopped generating lift. The aircraft would shake slightly, the nose would drop, and they would begin to descend until the wing began flying again. "The key is not to panic," Hayes explained as they climbed to a safe altitude. Stalls are completely recoverable if you know what to do. The aircraft wants to fly. Your job is to help it do what it's designed to do. When Hayes demonstrated the first stall, Maya felt her stomach drop as the aircraft suddenly lost lift and began to descend. The sensation was terrifying, like being in an elevator that had suddenly lost its cables. But Hayes remained calm, making the appropriate control inputs to recover, and within seconds they were flying normally again. "Your turn," he said. Maya's hands were shaking as she took the controls. The idea of deliberately causing the aircraft to stop flying went against every survival instinct she had. But she trusted Hayes, and she was determined to learn. She pulled the nose up gradually, reducing the airspeed until the aircraft began to shake. Then the warning horn sounded, the nose dropped, and they were in a stall. For a moment, Maya froze, overwhelmed by the sensation of falling. Then Hayes's voice cut through her panic. "Lower the nose, add power, level the wings." Maya followed his instructions, and the aircraft recovered smoothly. She'd done it. She deliberately stalled the aircraft and recovered successfully. "Excellent," Hayes said. "That was a textbook recovery. How did it feel?" Maya was quiet for a moment, processing the experience. "Scary," she admitted, "but also manageable, like something I could learn to do automatically." "That's exactly right. Emergency procedures need to become second nature so you can execute them even when you're scared or under pressure. The more you practice them, the more confident you'll become." As they practiced more stalls, Maya began to see a pattern in her fear. The initial terror was always overwhelming, but once she understood what was happening and had a plan for dealing with it, the fear became manageable. She was learning to work with her fear rather than being controlled by it. After the lesson, as they were securing the aircraft, Hayes made an observation that would stay with Maya for years to come. "You know," he said, "some people are afraid of heights because they don't trust themselves. They're afraid they'll do something stupid, like jump or fall. But your fear is different. You're afraid of heights because you respect them. You understand the danger, and you're appropriately cautious. That's not a weakness in a pilot. That's a strength." Maya had never thought of her fear that way before. She'd always seen it as a limitation, something that held her back from achieving her goals. But Hayes was suggesting that her fear might actually make her a better pilot, more careful and attentive to safety than someone who was naturally fearless. Over the following weeks, Maya's lessons continued, each one building on the previous one. She learned about weather, about navigation, about radio communications with air traffic control. She practiced emergency procedures until they became automatic responses. She studied aircraft systems until she could explain how every component worked and what would happen if it failed. But most importantly, she learned to manage her fear. She developed techniques for staying calm during stressful situations, for focusing on the task at hand rather than worrying about worst-case scenarios. She learned to trust her training and her instructor, and gradually she began to trust herself. The other students began to notice her progress. Ashley Chun, the trust fund kid who'd initially dismissed Maya as another wannabe, started asking her for help with navigation problems. Marcus Thompson, the former mechanic, began including her in conversations about aircraft systems. Even Jake Morrison, who'd made fun of her on the first day, started treating her with grudging respect. Sarah Williams, the natural pilot who'd defended Maya on her first day, became her closest friend among the students. After lessons, they would sit in the airport coffee shop and talk about their goals, their fears, and their dreams of flying professionally. "You know what I admire about you?" Sarah said one afternoon as they reviewed weather theory. "You're not trying to pretend you're not scared. You're honest about it, and you're dealing with it head-on. That takes real courage." Maya smiled. "I don't feel very courageous most of the time." Half the time I'm terrified I'm going to embarrass myself or crash the airplane. But you keep showing up, Sarah pointed out. You keep pushing yourself to learn and improve. That's what courage really is. It's not the absence of fear. It's doing what you need to do despite the fear. As Maya's flight hours accumulated, she began to notice changes in herself that went beyond just flying skills. She was more confident in other areas of her life, more willing to take on challenges that would have intimidated her before. She was learning that fear didn't have to be a limitation if you knew how to work with it. But the real test was still ahead of her. Hayes had announced that she was approaching the point where she would need to solo, to fly the aircraft by herself without an instructor. The thought terrified her more than anything she'd experienced so far. Flying with Hayes was scary enough. Flying alone seemed impossible. But as Maya sat in her apartment that night, studying for her written exam and thinking about how far she'd come, she realized something had changed. She was still afraid, but she was no longer paralyzed by her fear. She had learned to respect it, to use it as a tool for staying alert and focused, rather than letting it control her decisions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears to overcome, new skills to master. But tonight, for the first time since she'd started this journey, Maya Rodriguez felt like she might actually have what it took to become a pilot. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer the same person who had stood at the base of that Cessna on her first day, trembling with fear and uncertainty. She was becoming something new, something stronger, something that even she hadn't known she was capable of being. And the best part was, she was just getting started. The morning of Maya's first solo flight arrived with unseasonably turbulent weather. Gusty winds rocked the small aircraft tied down on the flight line, and the windsock at the end of the runway snapped back and forth like an angry flag. Maya stood at the window of the flight school office, watching other instructors cancel lessons, and student pilots look relieved to postpone their flights. Not ideal conditions for a first solo, Haz said, joining her at the window. But that's aviation for you. Mother Nature doesn't consult our training schedules. Maya's stomach was already churning with pre-solo nerves, and the weather wasn't helping. She'd been dreading and anticipating this moment for weeks. Hayes had been dropping hints that she was ready, that her skills had progressed to the point where she could safely handle the aircraft alone. But the idea of being in the cockpit without his calm, reassuring presence felt overwhelming. "Are we still going up?" she asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. Part of her wanted the weather to be bad enough to postpone the solo, to give her more time to prepare mentally. Hayes checked the latest weather report on his tablet. Winds are gusting to 22 knots, but they're fairly steady and right down the runway. Visibility is good, ceiling is high. It's rough, but it's within limits for a student solo. He looked at her carefully, reading the tension in her posture. "The question is, are you ready? I can delay this if you need more time." Maya was quiet for a long moment. Around them, other students were packing up their materials and heading home. Jake Morrison walked past with his flight bag, shaking his head. "Crazy weather to be flying in," he muttered. "Especially for someone who's afraid of heights." The comment stung, but it also crystallized something for Maya. She'd been working for months to overcome her fear, to prove to herself and others that acrophobia didn't disqualify her from pursuing her dreams. If she backed down now because of some wind, she'd be proving all the doubters right. "I'm ready," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Hayes smiled. "Good, let's go fly." The pre-flight inspection took longer than usual in the gusty conditions. Maya had to brace herself against the wind as she checked the control surfaces, and she double-checked that everything was properly secured. The aircraft rocked slightly on its landing gear as wind gusts hit it from different angles. "Remember," Hayes said as they climbed into the cockpit, "turbulence feels worse than it actually is. The aircraft is designed to handle much more stress than we'll encounter today. Your job is to stay relaxed and make smooth control inputs. The taxi to the runway was bumpy, with the aircraft wanting to weather vane into the wind. Maya had to use assertive rudder inputs to keep them tracking. Straight down the taxiway. When they reached the run-up area, Hayes had her practice some control movements in the wind. "Feel how the aircraft responds," he said. "The wind is trying to push us around, but you have the controls to counteract it. Don't fight the turbulence. Work with it." As they went through the pre-takeoff checklist, Hayes explained what they were going to do. "I'll take off and fly the pattern with you first. Let you feel how the aircraft handles in these conditions. Then I'll bring us back. Get out, and you'll do 3 takeoffs and landings by yourself." Maya nodded, though her mouth had gone dry. The idea of handling the aircraft in turbulent conditions was scary enough with Hayes beside her. Doing it alone seemed almost impossible. The takeoff was rougher than any she'd experienced. As soon as they left the ground, the aircraft was tossed around by wind gusts and thermal currents. Maya's hands tightened on the yoke as they climbed through the turbulence, feeling every bump and jostle. "Relax your grip," Hayes instructed. "You're fighting the aircraft instead of flying it. Let it move with the air. Just keep the overall attitude where you want it." It took conscious effort for Maya to loosen her death grip on the controls. As she did, the ride smoothed out somewhat. The aircraft was still being moved around by the turbulence, but her inputs became more fluid and effective. "That's better," Hayes said. "Now you're flying the aircraft instead of wrestling with it." As they flew the traffic pattern, Hayes continued coaching her through the conditions. When to add power to compensate for downdrafts, how to adjust her approach angle for gusting crosswinds, when to be assertive with the controls, and when to let the aircraft settle into the turbulence. The landing was challenging but manageable. Maya had to make constant adjustments right up to touchdown, but the aircraft settled onto the runway with only a slight bounce. As they taxied back to the ramp, she felt a growing sense of confidence. "How did that feel?" Hayes asked. "Rough, but doable," Maya replied honestly. "I think I understand what you mean about working with the turbulence instead of fighting it." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Exactly, you're ready for this." Back at the ramp, Hayes gathered his materials and prepared to get out of the aircraft. Before he opened the door, he turned to Maya with an expression more serious than she'd ever seen from him. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "I wouldn't send you up alone if I didn't believe you could handle it safely. You've proven yourself to be a careful, thoughtful pilot who makes good decisions under pressure. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and most importantly, trust yourself." He paused, then added, "Your fear of heights has actually made you a better pilot than most. You're more careful, more attentive to detail, more respectful of the risks. Don't see it as a weakness. See it as an advantage." With that, he climbed out of the aircraft and closed the door. Maya was alone. The silence in the cockpit was deafening. Without Hayes beside her, the aircraft suddenly felt much larger and more complex. Every switch, every instrument, every control seemed to demand her attention simultaneously. She took a deep breath and forced herself to focus on the familiar routine of the pre-takeoff checklist. Engine instruments green. Controls free and correct. Fuel selector both. Mixture rich. The ritual was comforting, connecting her to hundreds of practice sessions and previous flights. She'd done this before. She could do it again. Tower, Cessna 472 Alpha Charlie, ready for takeoff, runway 27. Student solo, she radioed. Cessna 472 Alpha Charlie, runway 27 cleared for takeoff. Wind 250 at 18 gusting 22, student solo acknowledged. The controller's acknowledgement of her student status was both reassuring and nerve-wracking. Every controller in the tower would be watching her flight, ready to help if needed but unable to do anything if she made a serious mistake. Maya taxied onto the runway, lined up with the center line, and pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft accelerated more quickly than she was used to, lighter without Hayes's weight. The gusting wind tried to push them sideways, but she corrected with rudder inputs that were becoming increasingly automatic. And then they were airborne. The sensation of climbing away from the earth alone was unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. Without Hayes beside her, every bump of turbulence felt magnified. Every unusual sound from the engine made her heart race. Every control input felt like it required her complete concentration. But as she established herself in the traffic pattern and began the routine of solo flight, something unexpected happened. The fear that had been her constant companion for months began to transform into something else. Not disappearing, but evolving into a heightened state of awareness that made her more attuned to every aspect of the aircraft's performance. She could feel through the controls that the engine was running smoothly, that the aircraft was properly trimmed, that all the systems were functioning normally. The turbulence was still there, still requiring constant attention and adjustment. But it no longer felt threatening. It felt like just another variable to manage, like crosswind or traffic or radio communications. As she turned onto the downwind leg of the traffic pattern, Maya caught sight of the ground crew watching from the ramp. Hayes was there, along with several other instructors and students. Among them, she could see Jake Morrison, Ashley Chun, Marcus Thompson, and Sarah Williams. All of them watching to see if the girl who was afraid of heights could actually fly an airplane by herself. The approach was bumpy, with the aircraft being pushed around by wind gusts and thermals. Maya found herself making constant corrections, adjusting power and pitch to maintain the proper glide path. But her hands were steady on the controls, and her mind was clear and focused. As she crossed the runway threshold and flared for landing, a particularly strong gust of wind lifted the right wing. For a moment, Maya felt the familiar spike of panic as the aircraft tilted dramatically. But instead of freezing or overreacting, she responded with smooth, measured control inputs that leveled the wings and settled the aircraft onto the runway. It wasn't a perfect landing, but it was safe and controlled. Maya felt a surge of pride as she added power and took off again. For her second circuit, the second pattern felt more comfortable, more routine. Maya was beginning to trust that she could handle whatever the weather threw at her. The turbulence was still there, but it had become just another factor to consider and manage rather than something to fear. Her second landing was smoother, and her third was almost graceful despite the gusting winds. As she taxied back to the ramp after her final touchdown, Maya realized something fundamental had changed. She was no longer a student pilot who needed constant supervision and guidance. She was a pilot who could safely operate an aircraft independently. Hayes was grinning as she shut down the engine and secured the aircraft. "How was that?" he asked, though her expression had already given him the answer. "Incredible, Maya," sighed, her voice filled with wonder. "Scary, but incredible. I can't believe I actually did it." "I can," Hayes replied. "You flew that aircraft like you've been doing it for years, even in conditions that would challenge experienced pilots." As word spread that Maya had successfully completed her first solo in gusty conditions, other students and instructors gathered around to congratulate her. Sarah Williams was the first to reach her, wrapping her in a hug that lifted her off the ground. "You did it!" Sarah exclaimed. "You actually did it!" And in weather that had half the flight school canceling lessons. Even Jake Morrison approached, his usual arrogance replaced by something that might have been respect. "Nice flying, Rodriguez," he said quietly. That wasn't easy conditions for a first solo. But the moment that meant the most to Maya came when Chief Flight Instructor Captain Hayes pulled her aside as the celebration continued around them. "I want to tell you something," he said. "In 30 years of teaching people to fly, I've seen every type of student imaginable. The naturals who make it look effortless, The hard workers who compensate for lack of natural ability with determination. The overconfident ones who have to learn humility the hard way. He paused, looking at her with an expression of genuine admiration. But I've rarely seen a student pilot demonstrate the kind of judgment and skill under pressure that you showed today. You didn't just complete your solo. You mastered challenging conditions that would intimidate pilots with 10 times your experience. Maya felt tears welling up in her eyes. Thank you, sir. That means everything to me. Don't thank me yet, Hayes said with a smile. This is just the beginning. You've got a lot more to learn, a lot more challenges ahead. But today, you proved something important. You proved that fear doesn't have to limit what you can achieve. That evening, Maya called her mother to share the news. Her mother's voice was filled with pride and amazement as Maya described the flight, the weather conditions, and the feeling of flying alone for the first time. I'm so proud of you, Mia, her mother said. I know how scared you were when you started this, how many people told you it was impossible, but you didn't give up. You faced your fear and conquered it. Maya smiled, though her mother couldn't see it through the phone. I didn't conquer it, Mama. I learned to work with it. There's a difference. Her brother texted her dozens of messages throughout the evening, each one more excited than the last. He'd been telling everyone at school about his sister, the pilot. And now he had a real story to share. His pride and enthusiasm reminded Maya why she'd started this journey in the first place. As she lay in bed that night, Maya reflected on how much had changed since her first lesson months ago. She was no longer the terrified young woman who could barely stand to look at an aircraft. She was a pilot who had successfully completed her first solo flight in challenging conditions. But more than that, she had discovered something about herself that she'd never known existed. She had courage. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to act decisively despite fear. She had judgment, the capacity to assess situations and make good decisions under pressure. And she had determination, the willingness to keep working toward her goals, even when the path seemed impossible. The next morning, Maya arrived at the airport early, eager to continue her training. Hayes had scheduled her for her first cross-country flight, a navigation exercise that would take her to airports she'd never seen before. It was another milestone, another step toward her goal of becoming a commercial pilot. As she performed her pre-flight inspection, Maya noticed several other students watching her. There was a new respect in their eyes, an acknowledgement that she belonged here. Jake Morrison even asked if she had any tips for dealing with turbulence, apparently having heard about her performance in the gusty conditions. Just remember that the aircraft is designed to handle much more than you think, Maya told him, unconsciously echoing Hayes' words. Don't fight the turbulence, work with it. During her cross-country flight, Maya encountered several new challenges. She had to navigate using pilotage and dead reckoning, calculating wind drift and adjusting her heading to reach unfamiliar airports. She had to communicate with different control towers, each with their own procedures and traffic patterns. She had to make decisions about weather and route changes without Hayes there to guide her, but each challenge felt manageable. Her fear was still there, still keeping her alert and careful, but it no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it sharpened her focus and made her more attentive to details that less fearful pilots might overlook. When she landed at her first destination airport, the tower controller complimented her on her approach and landing. When she computed her navigation errors and found them within acceptable limits, she felt a surge of pride in her growing competence. When she successfully completed the entire flight and returned to her home airport, she knew she had crossed another important threshold. How did it go? Hayes asked as she tied down the aircraft. Better than I expected, Maya replied. I was nervous about navigating to unfamiliar airports, but once I got into the routine of it, it felt natural. Like connecting dots on a map. Hayes nodded approvingly. Navigation is all about building a mental picture of where you are and where you're going. You seem to have a good aptitude for it." As Maya's training continued, she began to notice that other students were seeking her out for advice and study sessions. Her reputation as someone who had overcome significant challenges to become a competent pilot was spreading throughout the flight school. Students who were struggling with their own fears or technical difficulties started asking her how she had managed to progress so quickly. Maya found herself becoming an unofficial mentor to newer students, sharing the techniques she'd learned for managing anxiety and building confidence. She discovered that helping others actually reinforced her own learning and made her feel more confident in her own abilities. "You know," Sarah Williams said one afternoon as they reviewed navigation procedures together, "you've become kind of a legend around here. The girl who was afraid of heights but became one of the most competent student pilots anyone's seen." Maya smiled at the description. "I'm not sure about the legend part, but I guess I have come a long way." "You have," Sarah insisted. "And not just in flying skills. You've become someone people look up to, someone they turn to for advice and encouragement. That's not something you can teach or learn from a book. That's character." As Maya accumulated more flight hours and passed more check rides, she began to think seriously about her next steps. Her goal was still to become a commercial airline pilot, but she was beginning to understand the long path that lay ahead. She would need to build hundreds of hours of flight time, obtain advanced ratings and certifications, and probably work as a flight instructor or charter pilot before any airline would consider hiring her. But for the first time since she'd started this journey, the goal seemed achievable rather than impossible. She had proven to herself that she could overcome her fear, master complex skills, and perform under pressure. The rest was just a matter of time, dedication, and continued learning. Hayes called her into his office one afternoon after a particularly challenging lesson on instrument flying. Maya had struggled initially with flying solely by reference to instruments, without being able to see outside the aircraft. But she had persevered, and by the end of the lesson, she was maintaining precise altitude and heading control even in simulated cloud conditions. "I have something to discuss with you," Hayes said, his expression serious but not unkind. Maya felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Had she done something wrong? Was there a problem with her progress? "I've been watching your development as a pilot," Hayes continued, "and I'm impressed not just with your technical skills, but with your judgment and decision-making abilities. You've consistently demonstrated good aeronautical decision-making, even in challenging situations." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The flight school has an opening for a part-time assistant instructor position. It's mostly ground school instruction and aircraft scheduling, but it would give you exposure to the business side of aviation training. More importantly, it would help you build the teaching experience that most airlines look for in their pilot candidates." Maya stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you an opportunity," Hayes corrected. "The pay isn't much, and you'd still be continuing your own training. But it would give you a chance to help other students while building your own experience and credentials." Maya didn't hesitate. "Yes, absolutely yes," Hayes smiled. "I thought you might be interested. You start Monday morning. Welcome to the team." As Maya walked out of the flight school that afternoon, she realized that her journey was entering a new phase. She was no longer just a student trying to overcome her fear and learn to fly. She was becoming a professional, someone whose skills and judgment were valued enough that others wanted to learn from her. The girl who had stood at the base of a Cessna months ago, trembling with fear and uncertainty, was gone. In her place was a pilot who could handle turbulent weather, navigate to unfamiliar airports, and inspire other students to overcome their own challenges. But Maya knew this was still just the beginning. She had much more to learn, many more challenges to face, and a long road ahead before she would be sitting in the cockpit of a commercial airliner. The difference was that now she believed she could actually get there. As she drove home that evening, Maya thought about all the people who had doubted her, who had suggested that someone afraid of heights had no business learning to fly. She thought about Jake Morrison's mocking comments, about the skeptical looks from other students, about her own moments of crushing self-doubt. But mostly, she thought about Hayes's words on her first day, that fear could be a strength rather than a weakness, that respect for the dangers of aviation could make her a better pilot than someone who was naturally fearless. Looking back, she could see that he had been right. Her fear had made her more careful, more prepared, more attentive to safety than she might have been otherwise. It had forced her to truly understand what she was doing rather than just going through the motions. As she pulled into her apartment complex, Maya caught sight of an airliner passing overhead, its navigation lights blinking against the evening sky. Someday, she thought, she would be in the cockpit of an aircraft like that, responsible for the safety of hundreds of passengers, navigating across continents and through weather systems that would challenge every skill she possessed. The thought still scared her, but it no longer seemed impossible. Maya Rodriguez was learning to fly, not despite her fear of heights, but because of everything that fear had taught her about respect, preparation, and the value of facing your challenges head-on. And she was discovering that sometimes the things that scare us most are the things that have the power to transform us into something far greater than we ever imagined we could be. 2 years later, Maya stood in the crew briefing room at Horizon Regional Airlines, adjusting the gold stripes on her uniform sleeves. The 4 bars of a captain gleamed under the fluorescent lights, each one representing years of dedication, countless hours of study, and challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. At 25, she was the youngest captain in the airlines history and one of the few who had started their aviation career terrified of leaving the ground. The morning briefing was routine. Weather patterns across the Pacific Northwest, aircraft status reports, passenger loads, and fuel calculations. Maya absorbed every detail with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. Her first officer, Captain Lisa Chun, a veteran pilot with 15 years of experience, respected Maya's thoroughness even though she was technically junior in age and company seniority. "Looks like we've got some weather moving in this afternoon," Lisa observed, studying the meteorological charts. "Nothing severe, but some moderate turbulence possible between Seattle and Portland." Maya nodded, already mentally reviewing the passenger briefings she would need to make and the additional precautions they might need to take. Her reputation for smooth flights in rough conditions had spread throughout the airline. Passengers specifically requested flights with Captain Rodriguez when weather was questionable, knowing they would be in capable hands. The aircraft assigned to their route was a regional jet carrying 76 passengers, including a group of nervous first-time flyers and several business travelers who commuted regularly between cities. As Maya conducted her pre-flight inspection, she noticed one passenger watching her through the terminal windows. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, pressed against the glass with wide eyes full of wonder and curiosity. Maya smiled and waved. The girl waved back enthusiastically, then turned to say something to an adult beside her. Maya remembered being that age, looking up at aircraft with a mixture of fascination and terror, never imagining she would someday be the person responsible for making those massive machines fly safely through the sky. The pre-flight procedures were second nature now, but Maya still performed each check with the same careful attention she had learned during her earliest training. Engine parameters, hydraulic systems, navigation equipment, communication radios. Every system had to be perfect before she would authorize pushback from the gate. Tower, Horizon 347 Heavy, requesting clearance for departure, runway 16 right. Maya radioed as they completed their taxi checklist. Horizon 347 Heavy, runway 16 right, cleared for takeoff. Wind 180 at 12, gusting to 18. As they rolled onto the runway, Maya felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that still accompanied every takeoff. Not fear anymore, but a heightened awareness of the responsibility she carried. 76 passengers had entrusted their lives to her skill and judgment. Their families expected them to arrive safely at their destinations. That responsibility was both humbling and energizing. The takeoff was smooth despite the gusty winds. Maya's hands moved automatically across the controls, adjusting power settings and flight controls with the unconscious precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. As they climbed through the clouds into clear sky above, she felt the same sense of wonder that had first captured her imagination years ago. "Beautiful day once you get above the weather," Lisa commented, admiring the view of snow-capped mountains stretching to the horizon. "It always is," Maya replied. "That's one of the things I love most about this job. No matter what's happening on the ground, up here there's always sunshine and clear skies if you climb high enough." 30 minutes into the flight, they encountered the turbulence that had been forecast. Maya immediately activated the seatbelt sign and made a calm, reassuring announcement to the passengers. She had learned that the key to managing passenger anxiety during rough weather was to project confidence, while being completely honest about what they were experiencing. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez from the flight deck. We're encountering some expected turbulence as we pass through a weather system. This is completely normal and poses no safety concerns, but for your comfort and safety, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We expect to be through this weather in about 10 minutes, and I'll update you as conditions change." As the aircraft was buffeted by wind gusts and thermal currents, Maya made subtle adjustments to their altitude and speed to find smoother air. Her techniques for working with turbulence rather than fighting it had been refined through years of experience in challenging conditions. What might have been a rough, uncomfortable ride became merely bumpy. "Nice job finding the smooth air," Lisa observed as they broke through the weather system into calmer conditions. "I've flown with captains who would have just pushed through that turbulence without trying to minimize it," Maya smiled. "I learned a long time ago that a little extra effort to keep passengers comfortable goes a long way toward making everyone's day better." The approach into Portland was routine until they were 5 miles from the runway. Air traffic control called with an urgent request that would test every skill Maya had developed over her career. "Horizon 347, we have an emergency aircraft on. Final approach. Medical emergency on board, requesting priority handling. We need you to execute an immediate go-around and enter a holding pattern," Maya responded without hesitation. "Horizon 347, executing go-around, standing by for holding. Instructions." She smoothly applied power and raised the landing gear as they climbed away from the runway. Lisa was already pulling up the holding pattern procedures and calculating fuel requirements. This was the kind of situation that required calm decision-making and precise coordination between crew members. "Tower, Horizon 347, requesting holding at SALEM intersection. 8,000 feet, Maya radioed. "Horizon 347, approved as requested. Expect further clearance in approximately 20 minutes. As they established themselves in the holding pattern, Maya made another announcement to the passengers. She explained the situation honestly, but calmly, emphasizing that they were safe and that the delay was simply to accommodate another aircraft with a medical emergency. "We'll be holding for approximately 20 minutes while emergency crews assist another aircraft," she announced. "I know this is inconvenient, especially for those of you with connecting flights, but I'm sure you understand that helping fellow travelers in an emergency situation is simply the right thing to do." During the holding pattern, Maya found herself thinking about how much she had changed since her early days of training. The situation they were currently managing, flying at 8,000 feet in a holding pattern above the Columbia River, would once have been her worst nightmare. Now it was just another operational challenge to manage professionally. "You know," Lisa said during a quiet moment, "I've been meaning to ask you something. I heard through the grapevine that you used to be afraid of heights. Is that true?" Maya smiled. Terrified would be more accurate. I couldn't even look out the window of a second-story building without getting dizzy. Lisa looked incredulous. "And you decided to become a pilot anyway? That's either incredibly brave or completely insane." "Probably both," Maya laughed. "But I learned that being afraid of something doesn't mean you can't do it. Sometimes it means you should definitely do it." 22 minutes later, they received clearance to resume their approach. The emergency aircraft had landed safely, the medical situation had been resolved, and normal operations were resuming. Maya configured the aircraft for landing and made a smooth approach, despite challenging crosswinds. As they taxied to the gate, Maya reflected on how routine the entire experience had felt. An emergency situation, holding pattern, delayed approach, and crosswind landing had all been handled as normal parts of the job. Her crew had worked efficiently, her passengers had remained calm, and everyone had arrived safely despite the complications. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Portland," she announced as they reached the gate. "I apologize for the delay, but I want to thank you for your patience and understanding as we assisted another aircraft with a medical emergency. Your cooperation and positive attitude made a challenging situation much easier to manage." As passengers deplaned, many stopped to thank Maya personally for her handling of the flight. The young girl who had been watching through the terminal windows in Seattle was among the last to leave, accompanied by her grandmother. "Are you really the pilot?" the girl asked, looking up at Maya with obvious admiration. "I am," Maya replied, kneeling down to the girl's eye level. "What's your name?" "Emily. I want to be a pilot when I grow up, but my dad says girls can't fly airplanes." Maya felt a familiar surge of determination. "Well, Emily, your dad is wrong about that. There are thousands of women pilots flying all kinds of aircraft all over the world. If you want to be a pilot, you absolutely can be." Emily's grandmother smiled. "She's been talking about airplanes nonstop since she saw you doing your inspection this morning. She said she wants to be just like the lady pilot." "The most important thing," Maya told Emily, "is to never let anyone tell you that you can't do something just because you're scared or because other people think you don't belong. Sometimes the things that scare us most are exactly what we need to do to become who we're meant to be." After Emily and her grandmother left, Maya completed her post-flight paperwork and secured the aircraft. As she walked through the terminal toward the crew hotel, she noticed several airline recruitment posters featuring diverse pilots from various backgrounds. One showed a woman in a captain's uniform standing beside a large commercial airliner. 5 years ago, Maya would never have imagined seeing herself in such a role. The girl who had trembled with fear during her first flight lesson had become someone that young children looked up to as a role model. The transformation still amazed her sometimes. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Hayes, her former flight instructor who had become a close mentor and friend. "Saw the company newsletter article about your emergency handling yesterday. Proud of you, Captain Rodriguez. You've come a long way from that scared student who could barely look at an airplane." Maya smiled as she typed her response. "I'm still scared sometimes. I've just learned to use the fear instead of letting it use me." That evening, Maya sat in her hotel room reviewing the company's new pilot training materials. Horizon Regional had asked her to develop a program for helping student pilots overcome various anxieties and fears that could interfere with their training. Her unique perspective as someone who had conquered severe acrophobia made her an ideal candidate for the project. The materials she was developing focused on practical techniques for managing fear and anxiety during flight training, breathing exercises, mental preparation strategies, and progressive exposure methods that could help students build confidence gradually. But the core message was something she had learned through her own experience. Fear didn't disqualify you from pursuing your dreams. It just meant you had to work harder and be more deliberate about achieving them. Her phone rang, interrupting her work. The caller ID showed her mother's number. "Mia, I just wanted to tell you how proud I am," her mother said without preamble. "Mrs. Gonzalez from down the street saw you on the local news talking about that emergency landing you handled. She said you looked so confident and professional." Maya laughed. "It wasn't really an emergency landing, Mama. We just had to wait a little longer than usual." "Don't minimize it," her mother scolded gently. "You were responsible for all those people, and you kept them safe. That's not a small thing." As they talked, Maya found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. Every challenge she had faced, every moment of fear she had overcome, every small victory that had built her confidence had contributed to making her the pilot she had become. The next morning brought news that would present Maya with her greatest challenge yet. As she arrived at the airport for her next flight, she was met by Chief Pilot Amanda Stevens, who had an unusual request. "Maya, I need to talk to you about a special assignment," Stevens said, her expression serious. "We've been contacted by the FAA about participating in a demonstration flight for new safety protocols. It's completely voluntary, but they specifically requested you based on your reputation for handling challenging situations." Maya listened as Stevens explained the details. The flight would involve deliberately encountering severe weather conditions to test new turbulence detection systems and emergency procedures. It would be conducted with only essential crew aboard, no passengers, but it would involve flying through storm systems that most pilots would avoid. The FAA wants to demonstrate that modern aircraft and properly trained crews can safely handle conditions that would have been considered prohibitively dangerous in the past, Stevens explained. "They think your background and reputation make you an ideal candidate to show that pilot skill and judgment can overcome even the most challenging environmental conditions." Maya felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the description of the flight. Flying into severe weather systems intentionally went against every safety principle she had been taught. But she also understood the importance of advancing aviation safety through research and testing. "When would this take place?" she asked. "Next week. You'd have 5 days to prepare, including simulator training and briefings on the specific weather phenomena you'd be encountering." Maya was quiet for a moment, thinking about the implications. This would be the ultimate test of everything she had learned about managing fear and making good decisions under pressure. It would also be an opportunity to contribute to aviation safety in a meaningful way. "I'll do it," she said finally. The preparation week was intense. Maya spent hours in flight simulators, practicing recovery techniques for severe turbulence, wind shear, and other dangerous weather phenomena. She studied meteorological charts and learned to recognize the subtle signs that could mean the difference between manageable and catastrophic conditions. Most importantly, she worked with aviation psychologists to develop mental strategies for maintaining calm and focused decision-making in extreme stress situations. The techniques built on everything she had learned about managing her fear of heights, but adapted for the specific challenges of deliberately flying into dangerous weather. "The key," explained Dr. Sarah Kim, the aviation psychologist assigned to the project, "is to maintain your respect for the danger while not letting fear paralyze your decision-making. You've already proven you can do this in normal operations. We're just extending that capability to more extreme conditions." The demonstration flight was scheduled for a Thursday morning, when a particularly intense storm system was moving through the region. Maya arrived at the airport before dawn, running through her mental preparation routines as she reviewed the weather data and flight plan. Her crew for the flight consisted of Lisa Chun as first officer and 2 FAA test pilots who would monitor the equipment and document the aircraft's performance. The aircraft was a specially modified regional jet equipped with advanced weather radar and turbulence detection systems. "Weather conditions are about as severe as we could ask for," reported the lead FAA representative. "Multiple storm cells with embedded wind shear, severe turbulence, and some rotation. Perfect for testing the systems under extreme conditions." As they completed their pre-flight procedures, Maya felt the familiar combination of fear and determination that had driven her throughout her career. This flight would push her skills to their absolute limits, but it would also demonstrate the progress she had made in conquering the fears that had once seemed insurmountable. The takeoff was routine, but within minutes they were approaching the edge of the storm system. The aircraft began to experience moderate turbulence as they entered the outer bands of the weather. Maya's hands moved smoothly across the controls, making constant adjustments to maintain their desired flight path. "Radar shows severe turbulence ahead," Lisa reported, monitoring the weather display. "Looks like we're about to get the full treatment." Maya keyed her radio. "Approach control, test flight 23, entering the demonstration area. We'll be conducting weather penetration testing for the next 30 minutes. Test flight 23, roger. You're cleared to operate as requested. All other traffic has been rerouted clear of your area." As they penetrated deeper into the storm, the turbulence intensified dramatically. The aircraft was thrown around with forces that would have terrified Maya during her early training. But now, with years of experience and confidence in her abilities, she found herself analyzing the conditions and making precise control inputs to maintain safety margins. "Severe downdraft," one of the FAA observers called out as the aircraft suddenly dropped several hundred feet. Maya responded immediately, adding power and adjusting the aircraft's attitude to arrest the descent. For 45 minutes, they flew through conditions that tested every limit of both aircraft and crew. Maya encountered wind shear that tried to flip the aircraft, turbulence that threatened to exceed structural limits, and visibility so poor that instrument flying became the only option. Through it all, she maintained precise control and made decisions based on the systematic risk assessment techniques she had developed over years of challenging herself to overcome fear. The anxiety was still there, keeping her alert and focused, but it no longer controlled her actions. "Incredible," muttered one of the FAA test pilots as they finally emerged from the storm system into clear air. "I've never seen anyone handle conditions like that with such precision. The data we collected will advance turbulence research by years." As they returned to the airport, Maya reflected on what the flight had represented. She had deliberately flown into weather conditions that would have been her worst nightmare just a few years earlier. She had not only survived, but had demonstrated exceptional skill and judgment under extreme pressure. More importantly, she had proven to herself that there was no limit to what she could accomplish when she approached challenges with the right combination of respect, preparation, and determination. The landing was smooth despite gusty crosswinds, and as they taxied to the ramp, Maya saw a crowd of airline personnel and FAA officials waiting to greet them. The successful completion of the demonstration flight would be featured in aviation publications and used to update training programs for pilots around the world. But for Maya, the real victory was personal. She had taken her greatest fear and transformed it into her greatest strength. The girl who had once been paralyzed by the thought of leaving the ground had become a pilot whose skill and courage were recognized by the aviation community's most demanding critics. As she shut down the engines and completed her post-flight checklist, Maya thought about Emily, the young girl who had watched her with such admiration. Someday Maya hoped Emily would be sitting in a captain's seat herself, inspiring another generation of young people to pursue their dreams despite their fears. 6 months later, Maya stood at the podium of the International Women in Aviation Conference, addressing an audience of several hundred current and aspiring female pilots. Her presentation was titled, "Flying Through Fear: How Anxiety Can Make You a Better Pilot." "I want to start with a confession," she began. "My name is Maya Rodriguez. I'm a captain with Horizon Regional Airlines, and I used to be absolutely terrified of heights. I couldn't look out the window of a tall building without getting dizzy. I avoided bridges, elevators with glass walls, and anything that reminded me how far I was from the ground." She paused, looking out at the audience of faces that ranged from teenagers to veteran pilots with decades of experience. When I told people I wanted to become a pilot, most of them thought I was crazy. Some of them laughed. A few suggested I might want to consider a different career path. And honestly, there were days when I thought they might be right. Maya clicked to the next slide, which showed a photo of her during her first solo flight, obviously nervous but determined. But I learned something important during my training. Fear doesn't disqualify you from pursuing your dreams. It just means you have to be more deliberate, more prepared, and more committed than someone who isn't afraid. In many ways, my fear of heights made me a better pilot than I would have been without it. She spent the next hour sharing specific techniques for managing anxiety during flight training, stories of challenges she had overcome, and practical advice for building confidence in high-stress situations. But the core message was always the same. Fear could be transformed from a limitation into an advantage if you approached it with the right mindset. During the question and answer period, a young woman in the audience raised her hand. "Captain Rodriguez, what would you say to someone who's been told they're not cut out for aviation because they're too anxious or fearful?" Maya smiled, thinking of all the people who had doubted her along the way. "I would tell them that some of the best pilots I know are people who started out scared. They developed exceptional judgment and decision-making skills precisely because they had to work harder to overcome their natural caution." The aviation industry needs pilots who respect the risks and take safety seriously. Sometimes that respect comes from being naturally fearful of the dangers involved. After her presentation, Maya was approached by dozens of conference attendees who shared their own stories of overcoming fear and doubt. Many were student pilots who had been struggling with anxiety during their training. Others were experienced pilots who had faced moments of crisis that tested their courage and resolve. But the conversation that meant the most came from a young girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, attending the conference with her mother. "Are you the pilot who is scared of heights?" the girl asked, looking up at Maya with bright, curious eyes. "I am," Maya replied. "What's your name?" "Jessica. I want to be a pilot, but I'm scared of a lot of things. My mom says that's okay, but some people at school say scared people can't do important jobs." Maya knelt down to Jessica's level, remembering her own childhood fears and the adults who had either encouraged or dismissed her dreams. "Jessica, being scared is one of the smartest things you can be. It means you understand that important jobs require careful attention and respect for safety. The best pilots I know are people who are appropriately scared of making mistakes, because that fear keeps them focused on doing everything right." She paused, looking at this young girl who reminded her so much of herself at that age. Don't let anyone tell you that being scared means you can't do something important. Some of the most important things in the world are done by people who are scared, but do them anyway. That's what courage really is. As Maya drove home that evening, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a terrified student pilot to a respected captain and mentor. Every challenge she had faced, every moment of fear she had overcome, every small victory that had built her confidence had contributed to making her not just a better pilot, but a better person. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Hayes. "Saw your presentation online. You've become exactly the kind of pilot I always knew you could be. Proud doesn't begin to cover it." Maya smiled as she pulled into her driveway. The house she had been able to purchase with her airline salary was modest but comfortable, with a clear view of the approach path to the nearby airport. She often sat on her back deck in the evenings, watching aircraft pass overhead and thinking about the passengers aboard who trusted their lives to pilots they had never met. That night, as she prepared for bed, Maya looked out her bedroom window at the stars scattered across the clear sky. Somewhere up there, other pilots were navigating through the darkness, carrying passengers safely to their destinations, facing their own challenges and fears with skill and determination. Tomorrow would bring new flights, new responsibilities, new opportunities to prove that fear could be transformed into strength. Maya Rodriguez, the girl who had once been terrified of heights, was now someone that others looked to for guidance and inspiration. She had not conquered her fear so much as she had learned to dance with it, to use it as a tool for staying alert and focused rather than letting it limit her possibilities. As she drifted off to sleep, Maya thought about all the young people who might be lying awake at that moment, dreaming of flying but convinced that their fears made their dreams impossible. She hoped that someday they would learn what she had learned, that the things that scare us most are often the things that have the power to transform us into something far greater than we ever imagined we could be. The journey from fear to confidence, from doubt to competence, from dreamer to achiever was never easy, but it was always worth it. And Maya Rodriguez was living proof that no dream was too big, no fear too overwhelming, and no obstacle too intimidating for someone who was willing to face their challenges with courage, determination, and the understanding that fear could be their greatest teacher. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.